Yeah, I'm recording. So,
Cool.
welcome to Consensus Unreality, Season 2, Episode 4. We are joined today with author and researcher Paul Weston, one of the great chroniclers of the modern mythology and the happenings of the Western occult tradition and timeline. Frequent visitor of Chapel Perilous. We've got some topics on the docket today, and I think we're just going to get rolling.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Paul.
A pleasure.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of pitched this as, because we just kind of came off of a dive into like the Strieber kind of continuum. And so I know you've got some interesting insights into that. So I thought maybe we could just kind of start with what you have prepared on that. Yeah.
Okay, well, I first read Communion in 1987, pretty much at the time when it was receiving maximum publicity in bookshops in this country, had huge cardboard cutouts of the Grey on the cover. It was attracting a lot of attention. Now, I read it and I felt, because I was already very familiar with ufological literature, that it was, the most interesting and compelling account of a so-called contact that I'd read. But it wasn't really the straightforward aspects of the narrative that really hit me. I mean, first of all, I guess it was intriguing to me that Whitley's not exactly Mr. Normal to begin with. This is a guy that's already had some extraordinary novels out there at that point. He's been in a Gurdjieff group for like decades. So my familiarity with that led me to realise that he was someone that paid a lot of attention to his life, its manifestations and tendencies. So for him to suddenly come upon this hidden life, this was the motif, the secret life, that really, really struck me, because he comes to realise that there is another aspect of his life that he has not been fully conscious of. And as he catches up on it, what becomes clear is that life is actually his real life. The events that are occurring in it are the fundamental centre of gravity of his external life. And he has not been aware of this. And gradually, the subtle cues serve this reawakening, and he catches up on himself, and this results in a complete turnaround of his centre of gravity, because this secret life has been living his third dimensional life. That external life of what he thinks is his life is in fact just a kind of manifestation of something far deeper. And it was like a motif out of some fairy story, some myth. And I wondered, at the time, is there something in my own life? And there was, I'm not going to talk too much about that in this context, but in my book, Avalonian Eon, the connection I made with Psychic Question and Andrew Collins, this was all hovering in the background when I first read with Whitley. But it also reminded me of something in one of Carlos Castaneda's books. Now, Castaneda obviously has been completely deconstructed. He's had more than, a little bit of criticism. The end of his life was a tad problematical, to say the least. But I still feel that a number of his works carry a certain emotional tone, which is very meaningful to me. And in The Eagle's Gift, there's a whole narrative where basically Carlos Castaneda and a group of sorcerers who have been associated with Don Juan come to discover that there is likewise a kind of secret life that they have lived. And they've done stuff in various places, various towns in sequence. They come to some town in Mexico, and Castaneda and a female sorcerer are looking at this house, and they're both convinced that they actually lived in that house together at some point. That a whole bunch of things occurred between them in there. Now, regardless of all the problems of is it true or isn't it true, there was something about this theme that I found really, really fascinating. And it seemed like it was an echo of what I had responded with communion, they discover that a whole bunch of them have kind of been living on the other side, in the dream side, the Narwhal or whatever, and they've received a whole coherent teaching, a whole kind of doctrine has been communicated to them, and yet their everyday waking selves have completely and utterly forgotten this. And then various things reawaken them, and they rediscover, they take back on board, they recapitulate the whole thing. And this and the communion narrative kind of hung together in my head as something that there was a deep truth in there, that maybe it spoke to my peculiar life, but it also said something a little bit greater to people in general. Now, fast forward a little bit, I've been through all kinds of adventures. In 1992, in August 1992, I've started to get involved with a very remarkable young woman, incredibly psychic, but in an unusual sort of way. Now, she wasn't your standard issue space case. You know, she went on to be very, very anchored in the material world and very functional. You know, I'm going to say too much about her because she's got quite a high profile life as it goes. But there was a point where we went to a nightclub one Saturday night, and, you know, I'll admit we probably had a few spliffs, but what actually transpired in there, it was very, very surreal. It was a time when in Britain there was an ABBA revival, you know, and they started blasting out Dancing Queen, and she could see in the nightclub a whole bunch of tiny dwarf ETs having a little jig about. Wow. Now, this wasn't like a fleeting glimpse. This was going on, you know, she could see them for about 15 solid minutes, and they're all dancing about to ABBA. And it's like, you know, what the hell? This was the start of a very intense period that also ultimately involved me and her having some kind of past life thing involving the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. You know, she was round my place on Friday night, and she saw all the walls dissolve, the whole place turn into a Babylonian temple, and she was taken into this kind of blue flame and initiated as a priestess of Ishtar. I mean, that was just how the weekends rolled in those days. So we enter into this extraordinary association. And this is all in my book, Out of Guys. We soon meet up with a very strange guy. He was a Rajneesh sannyasin who supposedly channels angels and ETs and things like this. You know, he would just sit there with his eyes closed and sort of wave his hands about, and everybody would just fall over and flop on the floor. And the more visionary people would see some really crazy old stuff. Now, my friend of the time, she saw, you know, the entire room dissolve and some like mini Spielberg mothership come down, and a bunch of little ETs looking like skinned frogs, as she put it, about all over her. This was how crazy it was, and this was no drugs at all at this point. Now, what I found really intriguing was whenever this guy said the ETs are about to arrive, I actually, because I spent quite a bit of time with him, I actually kind of knew from a strange bodily signal what he was going to say in advance, because I suddenly found that I felt my fingers massively elongate and become really weird and spindly. And I used to think, I bet he's going to say the ETs are coming. And he always did. So it was my little signification that something pretty strange was going on. It might not be exactly what he said it was. It might, you know, the imagery was simply the form it took for those of us present in accordance with our particular temperaments and so forth. But something radical was going on. Now, at that time, I suddenly thought, let's look at the movie of Communion. Which I had seen years beforehand. And when we saw it, we were absolutely gobsmacked that there was this scene with the dancing ETs with Christopher Walken. Now, what is weird about that, I mean, that seems, you know, to completely validate this. But if you read the book, that isn't in the book. You know, that is one of those little bits of invention that Whitley probably got so fed up about that are just, you know, part of that strange quality of the movie. I still love the movie, but I can understand why he would be well well upset about it. But that was going on. And when I read the book again, I had completely forgotten that there comes a point where he starts to talk about Ishtar, and he starts to talk about the old, Babylonian depictions of her with the big almond eyes, and he's feeling that the main, ET, or we'll call it an ET, visitor that he had encountered was in fact female and was in some way connected with Ishtar. So this completely scrambled me, because it was something that I didn't see I could create wholesale purely out of some cryptomnesiac, having read the book, seen the film. I was interacting with somebody else. A whole bunch of things that were outside of my conscious control were going on. And it tied in for me with one of the ideas that I'd taken from Jacques Vallée, was this idea that there's a kind of the ufological phenomenon represents a kind of potential control system of consciousness. And I started to use the term carrier wave. That somehow or another, it served a whole bunch of other stuff, was accelerated and intensified and put through the blender as a result of the initial impetus that had been set off by that. And that was indeed the case with the whole saga that I experienced in 1992. That's in my book, Out of Gartis. We can come back round to that a bit later on and where that goes into Kenneth Grant territory. But I want to, lead from that into something else again that is part of my long-term connection to ufology that is in many respects just completely different altogether. And this leads us into, where I am in Glastonbury, the physical location of Glastonbury. One of the great champions of Glastonbury in the 1970s was a guy called Anthony Roberts. And he had been the main mover in an anthology called Glastonbury, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, which had introduced people to the subject of the so-called terrestrial zodiac here. He had been a great enthusiast of William Blake, and just the idea that Glastonbury is some kind of ultimate visionary beacon of the human spirit that will come to enlighten the world. And he'd had a legendary transition when he died of a heart attack on Glastonbury tour in 1990. Now, what I came to learn was that although this wasn't particularly mentioned in any of his books, the fundamental experience in his life and fundamental experience for his wife Jan as well was a UFO experience that they had in 1969. Now, he'd already come to Glastonbury. He was absolutely full to the brim with what I'd call psychedelic earth mysteries ufology. He's read everything of that time. He's imbibed all the kind of stuff from Desmond Leslie and Adamski's, flying saucers have landed, a proto-ancient aliens smorgasbord with all the kind of 60s material as well. So he's kind of primed. And then he and his wife are in a car driving, they're on the outskirts of London, and it's August 1969. And it's twilight, so there's no stars quite yet, no moon, nothing like that. And they say, I'm reading from his account now, a huge white disc shining in the sky in the middle distance ahead of us. To them, it's about the size of a big grapefruit hanging in the sky. So they slow down to watch it, and the colour changes to gold and like orange fire. And then they slow the car even more, and a bunch of small discs appear on the left-hand side of it and flicker and twinkle, and then they line up and all blend into this main disc. And then it kind of moves forward with tremendous speed, and they stop the car, get out, and it's now hanging in the distance, motionless in the sky, and they just get this feeling of total ecstasy come over them. And it then starts to move directly towards them, and it's pulsating with a green light, a blue light, others creates weird geometrical patterns. This whole thing is going on for about 20 minutes. It's not something that is just a very brief glimpse. At one point, it seems to resemble a fish moving through water. It's doing the whole lot, and then it just suddenly shoots off into the sky and ping, it's gone. And that's that. And, Tony's wife, Jan, is just crying. They feel like they've experienced God, A couple of days later, he's on his way to work on a motorbike and gets knocked off by somebody. A car hits him. And this means that he's got to have 6 months off work. And it's like he gets this massive download and he just starts writing this text, which is everything that he's been mulling over, just comes out. And it's like, it's a bit like maybe Morning of the Magicians. It's kind of like a whole bunch of stuff, the Lemuria, Mu, Atlantis, every ancient alien trope of that time that you can possibly imagine, the Great Pyramid being built by sonic engineering with the help of giant ET, stuff about the fall of Atlantis, stuff about Glastonbury and Britain and the megaliths all being the remnants of Atlantis and refugees from Atlantis. It's massive. It's about, if you published it as a normal sized book, where he got to would be about 500 pages worth. He spent a couple of years on it and then he ran out of steam. Bits of it were mined and published. Now, I ended up being the first person to read this thing in 40 years outside of the family household. I was reading it in 2013, 2014. And what I think this text would maybe, some people will probably, ridicule it, but I was in a really good headspace to just read it. I went all the way through it and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And there was talk of getting a new edition of this anthology, Glastonbury, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, out. And his wife, Jan, asked me, would I write an introduction to it and I would incorporate all this stuff. Now, that never happened, but what did happen was my book, The Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries and Ufology. This whole thing with Tony Roberts was the centre of gravity of the creation of that whole book, which eventually, once I moved on it, I did it really, really quickly. And I got it out to launch at a Glastonbury conference in July 2015, the Glastonbury Symposium. And there is a video of that out there, and I'm pretty happy with how that one turned out. And Jan was there, and there are a whole bunch of pictures of him shown. So it was like this profound contact experience. It had secretly shaped the way Glastonbury it was being talked about and expressed. In the 1970s, at the time when the town becomes this kind of hippie mystical pilgrimage centre and starts to expand into the form that it's in now. In the background, amongst a number of the people that had ideas about it, was this idea of the fact that there's stuff here that is tens of thousands of years old. I don't necessarily believe that. What I do believe in is the potency of the ideas. And at certain times, particular ideas set people off. And, this thing was a relic of Atlantean culture, and that there was massive ET involvement. And we're talking nuts and bolts here. Tony Roberts was a very definite nuts and bolts kind of guy. But this was all there, and it was a fascinating bit of history. And I was really, really chuffed that I got that out in the way that I did then. Yeah. But there was something else coming almost instantly that was just completely bonkers. And this is my third story. This was July 2015. I've got this book out. In August 2015, start of August, I call it my Glastonbury UFO Bodybuilders Day Out. And it was one of the most bonkers days out that I've ever had around here. And it all starts with a 1954 classic UK UFO case, one of the very, very best. Now, this happened not that far from here, about, 15 miles up the road from here in May 1954. There's a guy called Nigel Frapple. He's out at 2 a.m. He's coming home from spending some time with his girlfriend it's countryside out there, you know, and he sees this orange glow low in the sky, and he thinks, what's going on here? You know, is there a farm on fire? So he approaches, takes a look, crouches down, and sees, apparently hovering about 40 foot off the ground, you know, a weird classic 50s saucer, you know, dome-shaped object. It's got it seems to have a cockpit. There's portholes that have got light glowing inside. There's something moving about inside that suggests that it's in some way occupied. You know, there's a weird sort of flashing light disco effect going on. And it's actually hangs there for like five minutes. You know, again, it's not a something that's just a brief glimpse. And then he walks forward just a little bit more, and it's as if he's been spotted, and it just shoots off across the sky. So he's obviously, you know, 1954, although there's a little bit of flying saucer mania at the time. It's in the English countryside, it's not exactly a big deal. He tells everybody about it. He ends up getting interviewed. Desmond Leslie, you know, co-author with Adamski, turns up and interviews him. He's in the national newspapers. And the thing, you know, the BBC asked him to show where he saw this thing. And this is where, you know, modern investigators would just be so frustrated about this, because there's a circular burn mark of some kind on the ground where this thing was supposedly hovering over, that stays there for a really long time, you know. And we would obviously now think, if we could only get, you know, a sample out of that and analyse that and just see what on earth's going on there. And then he also finds somebody that lives nearby who has also seen this thing. You know, so there's confirmation. They've seen it from underneath. They've seen it flying off, and they've given, you know, a description of this. Now, the classic thing is that a couple of weeks later, after all this publicity, two guys in suits come and knock on his door. And one of them, he says, has these really terrible black eyes. And they basically say to him, look, you know, you've been saying too much about this. You know, you better be quiet or there's going to be a lot of trouble. Now, we now obviously think this is classic Men in Black stuff, but this is 1954. This is Britain, Somerset. You know, nobody knows anything about that stuff, but it's absolutely archetypal. There it is. So, of course, he doesn't shut up about it, you know, and it is passed down through his family. And his grandson, Lee, who's into bodybuilding, it also ends up really into ufology and ufological mysteries. And he came to work with a mate of mine called Phil in a factory, and Phil told him a little bit about me. So Lee befriended me on Facebook, and we had some interesting exchanges, because he's kind of, you know, we're both very interested in peak experiences in sport, mystical side of bodybuilding, a whole load of weird stuff like that. But he says to me one day, I've got a friend coming over from Spain, a bodybuilder coming over from Spain. How about we get my granddad and we all meet up in Glastonbury, and he tells us about his experience, and then you can take us for a tour of Glastonbury. So I said, yeah, that sounds great. Now, what I didn't appreciate was that Lee's bodybuilder friend from Spain was a guy called Dorian Yates, who was 6 times Mr. Olympia and is considered by some to be the greatest bodybuilder of all time, even better than Arnie. And he's like a beast and a legend, and led a very, very interesting life, you know, and has now gone down the rabbit hole and done ayahuasca and all sorts of stuff. You know, when I met him, he's obviously not in training anymore, but he's still a big guy, you know, and he told us all sorts of fascinating stories about the gym, the subterranean gym he used to work out in, because he was not a California Gold's Gym, Arnie and Franco Colombo type character. You know, he lived in Birmingham in the UK and trained in this haunted former martial arts dojo. And amazing conversation we had, and we end up meeting in a pub in Glastonbury called the George and Pilgrim, which dates from the medieval time, from the days of the Abbey, and is famously haunted. So there's me and Lee and a few other people, and Dorian Yates and Nigel Fratall absolutely enthralling us with his story of his 1954 UFO experience, you know, and the Men in Black and so forth. And I just thought, what the hell is the cause and effect on that, man? Yeah. Is all that microdotted and implicit in hyperspace in May 1954 when whatever the hell that thing was manifested? Where do you draw the line and say, well, okay, that's that thing sorted out? And it's like, it made me think, the tangents of it were absolutely extraordinary, but what it kind of went back on was that kind of theme of the secret life and the part of the self that is just outside the normal confines of space-time. And that kind of, the Strieber, Castaneda type thing, where that had hit me. Because, me and Lee, we talked about people like there's a 70s bodybuilder called Frank Zane from the Arnie era, who people don't necessarily realise part of his training for Mr. Olympia one year was to recite the Buddhist mantra, Nama Amida Butsu 3 million times. And when he appeared on stage and won this competition, people still argue about it, whether it was just all the oil on his body and the light. People said there was light shining out of it, And, I gave a presentation in Glastonbury on the mystical side of sport, very much inspired by Michael Murphy and work at Asylum and books that he'd done way back in the 70s. And Lee turned up for that. And I just felt, it is actually unity. Somewhere there is a gigantic, very, very big spectrum indeed, where somehow this is all the same thing. This is not separation. And the cast of characters, when you think of, say, Anthony Roberts and his UFO experience in 1969, I mean, he was not a fit guy. He was a huge guy, very obese, overweight. He died of a heart attack, on the slopes of Glastonbury tour. And then on the other hand, you've got Dorian Yates, Mr. Olympia 6 times. And you've got, me and my friends seeing these little E.T.'s boogieing about to ABBA. There is some kind of, there is a trickster thing that is at play that is trying to nudge you from your normal mental constructs as to what you think things are, how they hang together, what's possible, what isn't possible, where the dividing line between one subject and another is. So, that's what I put out there as our starting point there.
Wow. Yeah.
that last story is incredible. Wow.
Yeah, that's so funny. I was just for some reason before we got on the call with you, I had mentioned bodybuilding. So it's like so funny that just randomly comes up.
Right, it's cool. Yeah.
Wow. What do you think? As far as Strieber goes, I guess, how do you think that I mean, you mentioned in your book that also mentions Strieber, et cetera, there's some Grant connections. What do you think the connection between the sort of the UFO abduction, I guess archetype maybe, that came out of especially communion? Where do you think that fits into like the magical sort of tradition?
Okay, well, if we look into what's been made of the infamous drawing that Crowley made in 1918, that gets called Lamb. Whether Lamb is even considered to really be a name attributed to this thing, all of this is contentious, but it's got an enormous amount of mileage behind it now.
Yeah.
And thanks to Kenneth Grant, thanks to his closest associate, Michael Staley, there is a what you could call a cult of Lamb. And the cult of Lamb, if you engage with it, is undoubtedly a very powerful thing, or it can be. And the idea would be that weird face, that is represented by that drawing, is maybe the terminology can be argued about, but we'll say it's a mask of the Holy Guardian Angel, or a mask of the Daemon, or a mask of the higher self, or people like to draw these distinctions, but we know broadly what we're hinting at, and it's one of those things. The mystery is why at a particular time certain images take particular forms, because people are still experiencing Christian angels. People are still experiencing, Egyptian, Greek, Norse gods, goddesses in those forms. But for some reason, in the 20th century, you get this kind of weird mutation in which we've got this kind of science fiction reality in the ETs. But the whole thing with land, again, seems to be that you are potentially expanding your consciousness. Kenneth Grant, I think it's in Outside the Circles of Time, he uses this phrase extraterrestrial gnosis. Mm-hmm. And I've got a whole section in my Aleister Crowley and the Ian Horus of that title, in which I've gathered together an immense amount of material. And Grant, when he says extraterrestrial, the common kind of association with that is, another planet, another galaxy, a physical, realm. But really, it's about just not three-dimensional. In this sense, it's like not limited by the usual sense coordinates, the normal geometry, that it is some fundamental aspects of ourselves. You get all these discussions are the ET entities ourselves in the future, etc. Are they ourselves in another dimension? I think the way the Grant gnosis works is to just expand one's sense of identity. That we all know we've kind of got an unconscious, if you like, and we've maybe had the sense of its non-rationality introduced to us by people like Freud, and there's a lot to be said for that. But in fact, the sum total of our unconscious is far vaster. It is certainly very dreamlike. Strieber comes to this in communion, because a lot of this stuff is memories of what he's not even sure if he's dreaming it. It's something that's coming from a dreamlike realm. It's unconscious. But it's also, in terms of the distinctions that Freud and Jung used to argue about, unconscious is not necessarily sub. There can be higher levels of unconscious. There can be stuff that's working right now, in another dimensional realm altogether, that is in certain respects more truly ourselves than, us just looking and talking in our three-dimensional bodies and so forth. There might be a lot more going on. And it's the imagery and the emotive tone that goes with it and how it's discussed that seems in some people to be able to set off a particular, kind of mutation. The abduction issue, is almost like a subset of that. It's a thing unto itself. It's not the whole story,
Yeah, it's yeah. Like the image you conjured in the one vision that your friend had at the time too, of like the skinned frogs, is almost something right out of like Hecate's fountain.
Sure.
And it makes me think about what Grant calls the tangential tantrum, these sort of like causal, unintended effects of magical workings. And I'm wondering.
That's an idea that I have long pondered over, that when it comes to the free will, mm-hmm. of wherever it's really coming from, you think you know what you're doing, but in fact, months or years later, it's clear that there is actually something else going on from another perspective that was always what was really the case. And sometimes it just never gets figured out. Something like the Parsons, Hubbard, Cameron, Babylon working. That's a massive case of the old tangential, because I don't think the end outcome was consciously in any of their minds, and just what the end outcome is, it's still rippling out there. One's perspective on it can change almost yearly.
Right. Yeah, that's it feels like one of those what the effects are seem to change depending on
right.
John Michel, back in the 60s, in a very early ufological book, Flying Saucer Vision, he said, you simply aren't going to be able to work out really what the causes are. Yeah, the only way you can assess these things is by their effects, and those effects, they spread very far and wide. It's like I talked about the idea of this carrier wave back in the 60s, when it seems to be that UFOs were congregating above ancient stone circles and sacred sites. And, the French researcher had suggested they flew in straight lines. So then it was suggested that they're flying along ley lines. What happens is the whole subject of ley lines and the so-called Earth mysteries is completely regenerated. You've got people going out to ancient stone circles and hanging out in the middle of the night on UFO watches, and they're learning folklore, they're learning history, they're getting immersed in a landscape, something they wouldn't necessarily have done. And then it's almost like the external ufological aspect of it kind of moves on. And what you've got left with is a bunch of people of mystical intent and old states of consciousness who are now really getting into the history and the mythology of particular sites. You've had an awful lot of that stateside, without a doubt. I would very much believe that the phenomenon has acted in that way out there, the way it's activated your folklore. The whole thing with Bigfoot and just everything. There's a Native American law and what we can, all this sort of stuff. It's like something is massively activated in a way that it wouldn't otherwise have been without that stimulus. And when the stimulus is gone, it's disappeared like fairy gold. It's got this trickster thing to it. If you're a cynic, you can just take it to flipping pieces. And when you look back at some of the ufological literature, the 50s and 60s and 70s, or even in the 80s, where it seems to set off a lot of the New Age channeling, it's very easy to be cynical about it, but one of the things I'm most grateful for in my temperament is that I can go back and read that stuff and I can still grok it, Yeah. I mean, let's not forget the proto-New Age event, the harmonic convergence, which was in, pretty much this time of year, 1987. Jose Arguelles, set it off. Yeah, he's a mystical, visionary space case. He's also a PhD art professor.
Yeah.
But the thing that set him off on that, more than anything else, although he was massively primed by a lot of things, he met Richard Hoagland. And Hoagland had got some copies of his Face on Mars pictures that were, in his opinion, the best versions he has. And he showed Jose, and after Jose left him, he just went into, sat in his car in the car park and just totally went off on one and had some massive, great visionary experience where everybody's, there's a whole bunch of people lying in a circle on the ground looking up at the sky. And he thinks that it's the Earth's surrender rite. And the whole roots of the harmonic convergence come in Arguelles seeing the photos of the Face on Mars. Now, again, that whole issue of those photos and what that's all about, and is it real and is it BS, there's simply no getting away from the fact that those pictures had a powerful effect on people's heads at a particular time, and they set something in motion. Whether we've moved on from that now, whether we're leaving behind, they serve some very strange, mythic purpose, and they had a kind of time release mechanism on it, and a whole bunch of things were set in motion. And this is, again, this mystery of look at the effects of it. Look at the effects of it, and the fact that there are times when this thing seems very expansive, and there are times when people get the fear over it, and for me, the real action is in all this mythology and the way it activates human consciousness. I'm not interested in so-called disclosure. It's always a total letdown. It never does anything. It's like, what the hell's going on in people's heads?
Yeah,
this stuff? That's the real issue.
Yeah. I mean, it's the visions of like Strieber and even Lovecraft, and then the descriptions of the workings in the New Isis Lodge have this fear spectrum to them, which is seems like it's part of like a massive initiation, and they all.
I ran with the theme in my Crowley book of the kind of mass crossing of the abyss, and I've noticed, that Rob Anton Wilson gets a bit of stick these days, but I still feel the Chapel Perilous concept is very important, that you do get to a point where what you encounter seems to be, demons and full of secret societies that mean you no good, and that the world is intent on destroying you, but somehow or another there is a test of keeping your centre of gravity there, and in that, your relationship to these things somehow changes. And maybe it is a little bit like, some of the higher aspects of Tibetan Buddhism or so on, where, these demons actually transmute things, but it's an art that the mass mind right now is definitely lost, and people are careering off big time into all kinds of coronsonic chaos. But all the more motivation to try and keep that old centre of gravity.
Yeah.
Yes.
And abide with the massive amount of tremendously sound material that we've got, and not let it be submerged by a whole bunch of complete nonsense.
Right. It's you mentioned the face on Mars thing. I was just reading Strieber's The Secret School, and in that he kind of says that the face on Mars was another like inciting event for him as well. So
Secret School is probably, it might have been my favourite book of his.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's something about it that really does it for me, and always has done. People, there's all kinds of discussion about that period of his life and what was really going on. But again, It's like with communion, I think regardless of whether he was being messed about with by nefarious military and psychological organisations, there's just some motif of that deeper life there, and that the mystery of childhood and your early adolescence, and when is it exactly that you really do connect to this stuff? How far back in your life does it really go, and how that plays out, and how you just keep on coming back to these little intuitive things from earlier on in your life, and they do have that sense of a childhood dream about them. You realise you've always been primed. It was always working its way through,
Right. Yeah. That book, and it's structured in that 9 triads kind of way too, and that motif in his work is interesting too. The 3 knocks.
Yeah,
happening.
3 by 3.
Yeah. Well, that does sound very occultist, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, 3 by 3 is just this sync that seems to like appear with so much ufological stuff, and obviously has the Masonic connections. There's a weird relationship going on there that seems intentional. What do you make of something like the significance of like the star sapphire ritual and the Sirius connection, though? I mean, we're kind of talking about like the experience manifesting in these like personal mythologies, but something like that seems to have this like very consistent thread for, many people, like Ra and PKD and Robert Temple. It just seems to have this almost like historical lineage that occurs.
I think at the very least, it could be said that there is some intelligence that wants us to think along certain lines, because if we do, it reconfigures our relationship to everything that's going on around us. It reconfigures our relationship to how the world works, how societies work, what's at work, behind the rise and fall of empires. The idea that there are maybe, things that persevere, that survive beneath the turbulence and so on, and that what those things have at their absolute core is stuff that actually changes the way your brain works. Now, of course, you encounter the paranoia factor there. The thing is, I don't know, with Cosmic Trigger, I guess, I first read it nearly 40 years ago. I've read it nearly 30 times now. So it's like I realise when I talk to people that have maybe only read it once or read it a couple of times, that I've got a completely different feel to it than people, the old Discordian thing, Operation Mindfuck. That's great, that's very important, but that's not what I most take from it. What I take from it is the idea that if you engage with certain ideas from the likes of Crowley, it often boils down to quite a lot of self-discipline, and it involves, reading very widely in things that appear to present completely divergent, polarized, ways of looking at everything. But the idea is to annihilate those opposites, and to come to a higher unity. And the reason why that's knocking at the inner doors of our heads so strongly is there's never been a more urgent time. You know, I mean, we are so polarised now. It is absolutely bonkers. It is horrifying how polarised people are. We've got it over American politics. We've got it over COVID. People absolutely demonising each other to an extent that is obviously pathological and deranged, but people are so overcome with some strange righteousness of their own opinions. Mm-hmm. That's when you have to abide in the idea that, okay, Orthodox historians will say, nah, there's no great tradition, there's no sort of perennial wisdom, there's no secret societies that pass anything down. The very least we can say is that great visionaries like William Blake seem to just naturally be their own great tradition. And when you look at someone like him, actually, I wrote a whole book about him as well. The culture that he found in late 18th century London was absolutely teeming with all kinds of occultism, Kabbalah and weird arts, sexual mysticism, stuff, Swedenborg and so on. The great inspired people will always renew these elements through their poetic genius. Now there are times when this flows, but in my opinion, we had it in the 60s. One of the most nefarious things going down at the moment for me is the idea that the 60s were nothing but some MK Ultra psyop. That all the great rock stars, Jim Morrison, well, it's all MK Ultra. His dad was involved in Vietnam and so forth.
Right.
Therefore, the Laurel Canyon material, and also the idea that Leary is nothing but a CIA snitch, and every single bit of genius. I know people that even don't believe the Beatles wrote their own songs. They're all written by some intelligence group. And that, to me, what's nefarious about that is the idea that, like, magnificent, spontaneous genius erupting out of particular cultural contexts that are rare, is being, talked down, reduced, rationalised, when in fact more of the same is what will actually, change our emotional state and the way that we're responding to all this goddamn nonsense. Because if you think about the 60s, there was some terrible, terrible stuff going down. Vietnam was going down, all sorts, but it was made tolerable, it was made bearable by the fact that there seemed to be this tremendous tide of genius and intensity that was, working against that. And the ufological thing was part of it. It was huge. I've written at length in Alistair Crowley and the Inner Hall, so I've really gone to town on this. But it seems very important, again. We just had the 50th anniversary of the death of Jim Morrison. I saw stuff all over Facebook with this, the Laurel Canyon stuff. Right. Yeah, the facts are there, but the interpretation of them, the overvaluation of those facts, and the fact that, like, in the end, when you diminish genius, when you diminish the best of those times, you are actually doing a massive psyop on us now. You are making us just feel that everything is shit and nothing is worth it. Nothing can change anything. There's no point in being, creative and outstanding and going out there and doing stuff, because, it's all just in the hands of the New World Order, Illuminati, mind control, whatever. And what you're then left with, the only options you've got are pretty bad ones. You're just going to turn into a monster, and maybe that's how they want the situation to be handled.
Sure. Yeah, that whole the David McGowan Laurel Canyon book and program, I read his stuff, and that's sort of the way that sort of seeped into the esoteric, but more like the conspiracy culture online. That everything's.
I find a lot of people just take that as like fact. That's it.
Right.
That's all there is to be said about it. There's no, there's nothing more to be said on the subject.
Right. It's a useful. It's a useful tool, but to sort of assume. Yeah, it's. That's all it is, I think. It's a.
And I think on another twist of the spectrum, the recent material with all these, the TikTok UFO videos, the stuff is fascinating, but it's also very decidedly keeping it in the realm of nuts and bolts. It's very much keeping it. No mysteries of consciousness here to be seen.
Right.
This has got nothing to do with it, mate. Nothing going on in the human brain. Nothing has any continuity with mythology and folklore down through the ages. Let's just keep it focused on tech and power politics and all this flipping, it's reductionism again.
Right.
And it's all part of an insidious thing to just watch out for, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a clear directive of like framing it in a means of defense, like national defense and our airspace and all that stuff. Insidious is definitely the correct word for that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about what you thought of the whole the trend toward back towards like a literal alien from another planet flying here, like what you thought about that nuts and bolts trajectory of recent ufology.
It seems extraordinary considering the wealth of material that we've had ever since John Keel, Jack Valley and so on, that we still can't establish in the mass mind that there is this aspect to it, because as far as I'm concerned, it's not exactly boring, is it? This study of all this material is about as fascinating as anything I can think of. Books like Passport to Magonia and Operation Trojan Horse, they're still, to me, absolutely incendiary. They just, whenever I come back to them, which, maybe about every 5 years I'll read them again, they always set my head on fire. And Valley and the Virgin Mary visions, Fatima and just Lourdes and all this sort of stuff, and Our Lady of Guadalupe, just looking at all this stuff from that perspective, looking at it both ways, it is really, really important to our study of culture and mythology. If I was running some study of religion course at university, I'd have to stick in, Passport to Magonia and Operation Trojan Horse.
Yep.
Because it's at very least, there's a kind of phenomenological importance to it, in as much as this is how things are playing out in human consciousness, using the raw material of, our tens of thousands of years worth of religion and mythology. So that's that's a huge deal. That's a huge deal. But obviously, the vested interests that, just through sheer inertia and the cumulative force of just power, see it otherwise. They don't want us getting too interested in anything concerning culture. That's another thing that's just getting completely, flatlined.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think going back to the the program to kill stuff and Maury and all that, I think something that I recognized early on in your work, listening to you talk, years and years ago, is that you found, Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnels as a sort of like roadmap for engaging conspiracy stuff and engaging phenomena. And I think that's such an important tool that not a lot of people are equipped with, that you can, get in the frame of mind of program to kill, but you got to let yourself out of it,
Well, I very bravely tackled all the Montauk books over and over again, and I wrote a fairly extensive summary of about the first 5 of them in my Crowley book, and it was part of, conspiracism as a kind of path to initiation, if you like. It's really messing with people's heads, and it was because I've got the cosmic trigger background that it's like you try and get to what it's got, what are all the common points, and it's like sooner or later you're going to come across Crowley, sooner or later you're going to come across Jack Parsons and the Babylon working, sooner or later you're going to come across the whole issue of ufology and secret societies and so on and so forth. And also, you get this in Montauk, it gets to a certain point where you get the idea there's sacred sites all around the world. They're all linked up by some kind of grid. Is there ancient civilizations? It's like there's a certain level of the game that like just switches another bit of your head on, and then you switch yet another bit of the head on. But you can end up in this hall of mirrors, and that is where so many people are going now, because they are very, very attached to their so-called information, and the emotional tone that they bring to it. And it's kind of understandable, you know. I mean, it's not that there aren't ever any bad guys. That's the difficult issue. You know, we've got the little issue of the Nazis in the Second World War hanging over us there. You know, there are casualties. There are people that are quite deliberately, you know, going about and causing an awful lot of upset. People are dying, people being killed. But I've never believed, you know, and it's a very difficult thing to sort of engage with. But clearly the satanic panic was always overblown. But that's not to say that there's no reality to it. But it's like when you start extrapolating global conspiracy, and that's where we've just lost the plot now. You know, we've definitely lost the plot in this country. There was a big demonstration in London. You know, traffic was stopped a couple of days ago. More than 100 people demonstrating against Freemason paedophilia and New World Order Illuminati sacrifice. They appear to be primarily led by some strange evangelical Christian woman, and they, you know, parked themselves outside a big Masonic HQ in London. Made a lot of noise there, but when you actually kind of engage with any single bit of the information they're putting out, it just kind of dissolves away. Now, that's not to say there's no such, you know, there's no genuine cases ever, but the level of derangement that seems to be sort of excavated when you hit a certain level of the game, it's once again, you know, in all of this is why I found Crowley interesting with the idea of the true will and engaging with what you might call the daemon or the holy guardian angel. Is you've got to find some way of keeping the centre of gravity that is and you will reach a point in the game where it becomes pretty dangerous. You know, I mean, some of this is in my artist book, but there's a video lecture of mine out there called Southend Glastonbury Cremation Ground Mandala. Stuff got very serious for me when I was in my early 30s. There was, you know, people dying and going crazy, and, you know, serial killers very close to me. A whole bunch of stuff going on. And it was like being in the middle of some flaming mandala of some Tibetan painting with all these crazy ass, you know, personifications of different tendencies, you know, acting out all around, almost daring you, you know, to make a mistake by just going a little bit too far in one direction.
I'm just pondering that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as the satanic panic stuff goes, it really is. It's so interesting when that overlaps with, because the satanic panic is sort of like what's the word for it? Like a sort of a false image. It's like there aren't really.
I presume you guys saw the Netflix Maury Terry documentary earlier this year. That was a fascinating thing to see, and it was kind of sad to see the extent to which he completely lost himself in it. You know, the basic centre of gravity of it, you know, Berkowitz, the New York scene, then various people associated with that. There was some dark, spooky shit going on there for sure, but he just galloped off, and you know, he was one of the people responsible for creating that whole, you know, ridiculous climate at that time. And there are some people that definitely suffered as a result of it, people that went down for jail sentences and all kinds of things that should never have happened. But it is, you know, it's like the light and dark, you know, that particular time with Reagan and so on in the White House, and the kind of Christianity that was starting to be pumped out then. And now, well, I daren't even contemplate the extent of the derangement of QAnon and so forth. You know, one of the distressing aspects of recent times in Glastonbury is pretty much all the New Agers here went over to QAnon and Trump as a cult messiah. And a lot of them are still hanging on to some, you know, even though the whole edifice has fallen away and nothing has been delivered, nothing. There are still people coming up with some remarkable material that they still think, you know, is going to hang on in there. And it's like, it's way back in the 50s, that book, When Prophecy Failed. Yeah. You know, the convolutions that the people will put themselves through. So, this is one of the reasons I'm also a history freak. I'm really glad that I started off as a history nerd and that I'm pretty big on names, dates and places and making sure I've got the narrative straight. So that if I'm going to go off wildly, into all kinds of crazy ass speculation, that I'm at least starting from, knowing roughly what happened when and who was involved. And that speculation isn't going to, upset actual real historians too much.
Right.
Speaking of history and getting the facts straight, real quick, was Maria Orsic a real person?
Oh, man. Dear me. I was talking to Andrew Collins about Maria Orsic only a couple of days ago. As far as I'm concerned, I would have not seen anything that is earlier than, say, 1980 that says anything about any of this mythology. There's a guy called Landig who was about in Vienna in the 50s. I think he'd been in the SS. There's what I call second generation Nazi occultism. And it's got a life of its own. How many of the motifs you can actually find in real documentation from the Third Reich era is another thing altogether. Like, what's made of that Black Sun design from the floor in the crypt of Babelsberg, what people make of it now. The Maria Orsic stuff is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the conversation I was having with Andy Collins about it the other day, we were likening it to the Necronomicon. That it's kind of like some kind of astral grimoire. It's like it's something out there that everybody's kind of buying into, and it's got some kind of strange emotive power to it that it's kind of almost coming to life of its own accord. And there's a whole thing that, I think just as, Simon in 1975 created his legendary dangerous version of the Necronomicon, and, if you mess about with it, things will happen and you might not be too happy with it at the end. So I would say, there are people out there who are engaging with Maria Orsic and the Black Sun and Nazi ufology, and it's almost making it more real. It's almost bringing it through from the abyss. And I treat it with extreme caution. It is really compelling. What I've used the word insidious today already. What I'd say about this mythology that's insidious is it suggests that in the early days, the likes of the Thule Society, that there are actually some good people amongst them. Orsic and company, they're channeling this stuff from the ETs and whatnot. It's kind of, the intention's pure, and then later on, when it really gets going, it all goes to shit. Well, that's a bit of a bummer, but now we can kind of get back to what it was really all about. Wrong. It was always shit. It was always evil. They were all fucked up from day one, and if you start to suggest that actually there was ever anything cool about these guys, and maybe, that the bloke just took it off a little bit too extreme and it would have been all right without him. No. That's another one of these insidious things that you usually will find. It's like with Holocaust deniers. When you trace where this is all coming from, you will normally find people that aren't even remotely Holocaust deniers. They know damn well it happened and they could be quite happy if it happened again. But they would give you any amount of fucking nonsense. We've got at least one Hitler worshipping Holocaust denying ayahuasca visionary hippie in Glastonbury, who the mere existence of such a person perplexes me massively. Just a great warning, to be discriminating and just step back from some of these things to get the feeling of where they're really coming from.
Man, that's just a fascinating idea too. It's almost like you have like a historical tulpa retroactively manifesting with the Orsic stuff, and your work is, you've talked greatly about Crowley and Loch Ness, and it's it's the same kind of thing of this like almost like tulpa emerging through the history, and there's the trickster element of the connection with Typhon and Leviathan and back to the dark tunnels of Set, and it ends up with cute Nessie, you know, like there's just this funny trickster button on it all.
Well, yeah. Before we get too far away from the whole Nazi thing in relation to that and the topic, one of the things that I found really fascinating was to hear what the notorious Michael Aquino, Temple of Set fame, what he had to say about the crypt at Wavelsburg, because it's quite well known that back in 1982, he got in there and they were less strict then. They let him spend a bit of time in there on his own. And he did what he called the Wavelsburg working. But regardless of that, what he had to say was that he felt, using imagery from the Forbidden Planet movie, was that it was like a Krell machine. In other words, that there was something about the way this tower was configured. It's got acoustic properties which have never been, properly explained why they went to all that trouble. That whoever kind of hung about in the bottom of it, whatever they were doing there, they basically got the monsters from the ear to come out big time.
Right.
And they completely lost control of it. There was no way that they would ever be able to maintain control of it. And that was, where an awful lot of what was going on was amplified to the max, and came out there. I thought that was kind of fascinating, and I'm willing to sort of broadly go along with that as a sort of, at least a poetic way of understanding what's going on there. Because, this is a place where they had a meeting, whatever we can say about the occult side of it, we know that Himmler and Heydrich had a meeting shortly before Operation Barbarossa at Wavelsburg where they discussed how they were going to conduct themselves in Russia. And it was pretty much thought, well, tens of millions of people will probably die, but okay, whatever. We'll get what we want, and that's that. So this is what is occurring, in the vicinity of the Krell machine, and monsters from the ear indeed, and there is something very, anyone that's into Lovecraft can probably kind of appreciate a whole bunch of nuances in that as well.
Yeah. I mean,
I guess Aquino just died, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, a massively controversial figure for sure.
Yeah.
All kinds of stuff in the minus column, but I'm still, find it fascinating to at least hear what he has to say about time spent in the crypt at Wavelsburg.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. As far as the Maria Orsic thing, it like what Dave said about the sort of tulpa, but it reminds me of like like the subculture of like fan fiction, like that's like
people talked about QAnon, that it was some kind of interactive game,
right?
And that one of the things that characterized it was you brought your own stuff to the the Q drops, you worked your own things out. Well, yeah, people are in their own way doing that with Maria Orsic and Vril and Knots and ufology. What's difficult about it is it's more focused, so it actually potentially makes it stronger.
Right. Yeah. Channeling like a very specific, not like person that never existed. What's that experiment? The Philip experiment or something, right?
Right.
Yeah. At the moment, you see what would be very interesting now is if we then discover that she did exist.
Right.
Because did she really exist before we started all this malarkey? Have we actually sort of somehow messed with multiple timelines and somehow created her and the whole biography that went with her? The idea that something outside the gates of time is maybe wanting us to make it real. Right. This is a kind of Lovecraftian horror story aspect to this that I've always been very mindful of. Back in the days when I was doing psychic questing with Andy Collins 30 years ago, there was a side of it called black questing, which involved people tuning into supposed desecration of sacred sites, and we go along and we dig up stuff with weird inscriptions on it that have been buried at various places, and some of these things I didn't even know whether or not they had literally been buried by physical people or something that just manifested and was using us. We were a very unusual bunch of people. Some of the psychics had the ability to manifest stuff physically, very readily that something wanted us to make it more real. Something wanted us to bring stuff through. And this is where, that sense of responsibility and just, some kind of higher morality, has to somehow inform what you're doing. There are risks, of course there are. It's a high stakes game we're involved in at the moment.
Yeah, wow, that's so fascinating too, because that's actually the story of Maria Orsic, is that she was channeling something, was telling her supposedly to bring something through that maybe she should have hypothetically been conscious of not bringing through herself. It's like almost like a time loop, like the Atlantis story or myth. The story itself is a kind of touchstone.
Yeah, it's potentially a morality tale, but I don't think the fans of it are necessarily engaging with it on that level.
Yep.
I think the fact that Maria Orsic, the photos supposedly of her, the fact that she's conventionally attractive is definitely a huge factor. If she just looked straightforward, people wouldn't be latching onto it. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And that kind of exploitation, of a particular type. Quite deliberately, I think.
Sure, yeah, and the myths of the long hair to her feet.
All that stuff, yeah. Right. Which is like Aryan priestesses and blah blah blah. Yeah. You don't have to go too far down that road before there are massive great warning signals, or they should be audible on any sane person, but they're not.
Yeah. When we were looking into that, we did like a short dive into the sort of Nazi UFO subculture for an episode, and I didn't really know that much about it because it always kind of put me off, but I kind of went into it assuming that like some of the stuff, even if it wasn't actually like as big as books made it seem, I assumed Maria Orsic was like a real person. You just like very quickly like you see like, well, no one ever mentioned her before. Pretty recently. So it's so interesting how that retroactive creation of mythology kind of makes you think different things about what had already been sort of historically settled.
Yeah, well, I think she's vibing in the ethers at the moment, and I think something wants us to make her real. So if that isn't at least a moderate cause for concern, I don't know what is.
We'll put out the candles on that.
Yeah.
We'll put the sifters on. Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. What else? What else should we get into?
So what have you been working on recently?
Yeah.
Right. Well, obviously it's been a very strange time with the lockdowns and so forth. I've had an extended Colin Wilson project that I keep coming back to.
Oh, awesome.
And, one of the things about the later period of Colin Wilson is that he has this kind of little golden phase in the late 90s where he suddenly starts producing some great work again. And he was commissioned to write a 1-volume book on ufology called Alien Dawn, which I absolutely love to bits. And one of the reasons why I love it is because, as always, he uses it as a vehicle, basically, for his ongoing, obsession, which is the nature of human consciousness and his new existentialism and intentionality, and the fact that, we're not passive perceivers, we are actively engaged. And if we do that with the full knowledge of the greats, of whom, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky were a major thing for him, then that's where all the action is. And that quite possibly the ancient cultures had a better knowledge of this. And one of the things that's fascinating is from Atlantis to the Sphinx, there's always this kind of thing. How on earth did they work out the maths on the Great Pyramid, and some of these ancient structures? And maybe, they must have had help from ETs and so on. From quite early on, Colin Wilson is interested in maths prodigies, kids that can do enormous great calculations in their head in 5 seconds flat, autistic twins and a whole bunch of things like that. And he basically puts forward the idea that, these societies, and especially prior to, if we've got some kind of big ice age comet strike cut-off point that the likes of Graham Hancock would posit, what was the mindset of these previous civilizations that could do, global mapping or whatever? Maybe their shamans, maybe the people that they relied on for this information were actually these kind of, strange calculating prodigies, these strange autistic types. We're now very much, we have this sense of neurodiversity now in the modern world more and more, this idea that people's brains, work quite interestingly, and that there are certain types who inhabit a zone that's almost impossible to kind of get a handle on it, the maths prodigies. Colin Wilson gets to this, and what's intriguing now, Andy Collins is, I think he was in the Cygnus Key, and he's certainly into this now with the Denisovans and the mysteries of the ancient Altaic culture, that quite possibly these people's brains were completely different and they worked like that. And that the way they would have experienced everyday life, certainly the specialists, the shamans, the priests, the priestesses, would have been radically different. And this is one of the things that fascinated me about Wilson, that he got to this right at the end of his life. And one of the things that I'm running with, which I got from Ouspensky actually, is the idea of the long body, what Ouspensky called the Linga Sharira, that basically there's a fourth dimensional side to people's lives and destinies, and that Colin Wilson, was always going to end up where he ended up with Alien Dawn, and from Atlantis thinks he was always going to go through a whole bunch of things, and the sum total of his body of work, hangs outside of the normal space-time continuum because of where he connected to repeatedly, and meetings that he had, particularly with Robert Graves on the island of Daya. That was a real serious moment of transformation for him, where a whole new level of the ball game kicked in. These are all the things that I'm fascinated with. I'm trying to bring a different perspective on, it's a massive project and it could well be another year before I finish it. I mean, I'm hundreds and hundreds of pages in, but I'm not just writing a standard summary of his work. Gary Latton's already done a fine job on that. Yeah. Other people have done fine jobs. I'm trying to do a very distinctly, Paul Weston overview of the mystery of Wilson, same from the outside, same from a different kind of perspective, and the unity that's always there.
That sounds incredible. Yeah. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I love
Well, that's a bit of motivation for me to step it up a bit then, yeah.
Yeah. What is Alien Dawn your favorite Colin Wilson book?
I wouldn't say that, no. I think maybe Mysteries. Mysteries I came to at a certain point in my life. There's a whole chapter on the Earth mysteries in there called The Path of the Dragon, all about ley lines and T.C. Lethbridge and his dowsing, all this kind of stuff. I was just kind of starting to go out to all these places, just been to the Stonehenge Festival, just been to Glastonbury for the first time when I read that, and him using that as his launch pad into, the usual stuff about time slips, and synchronicities, which ultimately is one of the things I'm most obsessed about. That was a great way in for me with that book. I've read it quite a few times now, probably more than a lot of people would. In fact, the whole occult trilogy I've read it many times.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, he's such a the arc of his career is so interesting, and I like that angle that maybe it was sort of like this this long loop, or sort of like it all happened like in a fourth dimensional, like sort of as a, what would you call it, like a fourth dimensional object or something?
Well, yeah. And I do feel that the meeting he had with Robert Graves was an initiatory moment. Yeah. He does dedicate the occult to him. And he'd never really met anyone like Graves before. He'd hung out with a lot of literary figures, T.S. Eliot, Henry Miller. He'd even met Albert Camus in a cafe in Paris, I think, he'd hung out with a lot of these conventional figures, but Graves, Graves was a self-styled bard in the old style of a magician, and he'd been through a lot of stuff. He'd kind of had a shamanic death, rebirth, dismemberment thing in the First World War. He'd been wounded, I think, at the Battle of the Somme, and it was literally assumed that he was going to die. They had actually put out a dispatch to the effect that he had died, but he didn't die. He came back to life, and then not long after that, he went down with the 1918 influenza epidemic that killed so many million people. He went down with that as well, and he survived that. And he had been one of these guys who, as a young man, had a kind of strange experience. Colin Wilson writes about it, where he somehow believed that he just knew everything, that he had come to some sort of apprehension of how you can just organise absolutely all knowledge and understanding. And it stayed with him for, maybe a day or so, and then he lost it. Wilson said he'd never, come across anything like that before. But that is, this sets him up. Now, I mean, I don't know, I could tell you quite an interesting story if we've got a little bit more time still, relating to all this, because it brings rock and roll territory. Now, where I got my perspective from, this is a story that I've told in Avalon and Neon. I already knew this story, but it's the mystery of why you get particular bits of understanding at a particular time. There's a guy called David Allen, who was the founder of a prog rock band Gone. And, he was somebody, typical 60s kind of figure, hung out with William Burroughs, did a lot of acid and so on. He was on Daya, the island of Daya in Mallorca, in 1966, and it was Easter, and he'd been given some Owsley acid, and he was going to take acid with his girlfriend at the time, and this would inevitably have been a big deal anyway. But he knew about Robert Graves. He was on nodding terms with him, and Daya was a place supposedly that had been sacred to Diana, the moon goddess, so forth. He bumps into Robert Graves, and they go for a walk up what was one of Graves' favourite sort of hillside walks. And Graves does this sort of free-form rap to him, where he talks about the troubadours, he talks about the white goddess, he talks about the divine feminine, a whole bunch of the kind of things that Graves is well known for. And David Allen feels that he literally gets, he called it bioenergetic power transfer by osmosis. He literally gets some kind of transmission from Graves. And, a day later, he does acid with his wife, and they have this incredible visionary sexual experience that is like something out of a book by Timothy Leary. And he also sees himself, on a stage, and there are all these people looking at him, and there's a great light above him and so on. And he feels that he's been given the impetus to become a troubadour, and that he's been given, a mission. And that part of what all this was involved was this transfer of a whole package of ideas that come directly. They leap out of Graves and into him because he's ready. Now, he goes on, this is the beginning of his career in popular music. He goes on to found Gone, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But what I found interesting, because David Allen hung about around here in the 90s, and I did get to meet him a few times, which was great. And I read his autobiography, this story, back in the late 90s, and I'd written about it in Avalon Neon. But then I go back to Colin Wilson, and I knew this already. Colin Wilson became a writer in residence at a college in Daya in the late 60s, and he knew that Graves was there, and he wanted to hang out with him. So Graves takes him, they meet up, and he takes him for a walk up one of his favourite hillside paths. And when they get to a certain point up, Graves challenges Colin Wilson to sort of change into some swimming trunks and jump off the cliff into the water. And Wilson's a little bit reticent, but they do it. And I started to think, hang on a moment, this sounds like exactly the same path that Graves has gone up with David Allen. And from this point on, Graves talks at length to Colin Wilson. Wilson's just been commissioned to write a book on the occult. And Graves is the first person that he really engages with, and he sort of says, well, shall I do it? And Graves says, no, you better not. But he then starts talking to him about poetry, about the white goddess, and a whole concept of lunar knowledge. The theme of lunar knowledge is a massive thing in Colin Wilson's The Occult. In a way that it actually isn't. He almost he runs with the same ideas, but he never uses the same terminology again. And I'm thinking to myself, this is kind of like a dream. You know, Robert Graves has literally, with Colin Wilson, jumped into the sea of lunar knowledge. You know, he's literally chucked him in there. And Colin Wilson has just written this autobiography, an early one, Voyage to the Beginning. He's never the same again. You know, that is literally the point. He has met this guy who is like a shaman, who is like a bard, who is like a magician. And fair play to Graves, he's over 70 at this time. When he's met David Allen and when he's met Colin Wilson, he's served his purpose. He's not a young man anymore, but he has essentially set Wilson off in an extraordinary way that I don't think Colin Wilson himself ever realised it, and I don't think any of his biographers have either. You know, and I go to town on that, and I've got, you know, from that, I'm not going to go into it now, but I've got a similar kind of perspective on what happened with T.C. Lethbridge. I think he, you know, there's some very clear threshold crossings for him that are actually worth putting alongside Robert Graves. So I've had a lot of stuff going on in my head, but, you know, keeping a roof over my head and keeping my sanity during this period of time has prevented me from completing this project so far.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, Graves is so interesting. The last time I really looked into him again was I was really into the poet Laura Riding Jackson, and so I looked at their relationship a bit, and it seemed pretty strange. So yeah, I wonder. Yeah.
Well, Graves is a guy who can very readily be criticised for his attitude towards women. I mean, in The White Goddess, which obviously is in many respects a masterpiece, he actually says, you know, that women can't really write poetry. Well, you know, he's going to get slapped for that straight off. And there's a whole, you know, the way he conducted himself through his life was pretty strange. But he was nonetheless extraordinary. The White Goddess is extraordinary. And he was able, you know, in that circumstances to fulfill a very strange purpose for both David Allen and Colin Wilson.
For sure, yeah. That's so interesting. I had never actually, I knew that Wilson had dedicated stuff to Graves, but I didn't really know the full extent of that. I mean, I didn't know that story,
It was in The Occult that I first heard the story of how the White Goddess, you know, came to be written. And that has always been my kind of benchmark for being possessed by the creative force. You know, and you walk that level of the game engaged, no matter how much it might disrupt you, because there's nothing like it, you know.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that Colin Wilson book.
Well, there is going to be, I hope, a Glastonbury Occult conference in February, where if nothing else, I'm going to do a whole lecture on that.
Great. Excellent.
There'll be some pictures and that'll get filmed, and I hope that ends up on YouTube. So there'll probably be, you know, that expanded into an hour's worth.
Amazing. Yeah. And speaking of YouTube, got to direct people to your channel with many great lectures.
I've got a Paul Weston channel, and some of the things I've talked about tonight, the launch of the Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mystery Ufology, the hour-long lecture on that.
Yeah.
You know, that's up there. Real 18 certificate full stuff with Southend Glastonbury Cremation Ground Mandala. And for my Occult Battle of Britain, there's a whole bunch of videos of me talking about different phases of Nazi occultism and whatnot on there.
Right. We didn't even get into talking about that. Yeah.
I feel like there's so many directions we could go and go for hours. We could talk about 90s dance music and
I was talking about it a while ago, on somebody else's show. I mean, it was a very liminal moment.
Yeah.
You know, it has been said by a few people. John Higgs, who's written about KLF, has said the early 90s were a very strange time. And now that we're, 30 years out from it, we can gauge just how strange it really was, because it's sure as shit nothing like now, you know. We wish that maybe that wasn't the case, and that we had a little bit more of that vibe coming back on us.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess maybe one last question I'd like to ask, somebody who spent so much time researching, but also sort of navigating, phenomena yourself, and these sort of, different workings and processes of initiation. What advice would you give people who are looking to begin with engaging this kind of stuff?
Never neglect your physical health. Your physical health is centre of gravity. If you're in, a state of health and vitality, you are far less likely to believe a load of fucked up nonsense. I've got a kind of thing with my, unfortunately, I don't get all that often, but my basic thing is, if I had the flu or something, or I had a cold, or it's just a little bit off, my thing that I've trained myself, don't believe anything that you feel about how your life is in that moment. And that goes to the bigger reality as well, because the way you engage with information and ideas is incredibly dictated by the state of your psychophysical organism. I mean, I'm big on the Eastern tradition. I'm big on yoga. That's part of the whole thing of the limbs of yoga is you're readying yourself for how the old force activates in you, and whether it fries the end off your toenails or whether you actually sort of come out of it vaguely sane. A whole bunch of stuff will be activated. If you're, not eating, not sleeping, the chances of you being able to deal with it effectively are just law of diminishing returns. And again, if you can't, if you're doing psychoactive substances, all the more reason to sort of, discipline it, to draw the distinction between getting high and getting wasted. I used to find, if I went 6 months, going down the gym, going out running, shoveling vitamins down me, and then at the end of all that, smoke some Afghanistan black, I would be, I'd end up in my head inside some Gothic cathedral, having an experience of the download of the mystical tradition of the ages. Whereas if you're just for smoking that shit every day, all that's going to happen is it's going to turn mashed potato. You've got to be a worthy vehicle. Yeah. And I was fortunate that I had a voracious appetite for reading books. I could read a 250-page book every day, no problem. I don't do that now that I'm writing. But, a couple of weeks ago, I suddenly just got locked into something that was 500 pages long and read it in 2 days. Read stuff, and like go out of your way to cultivate the opposite zone, man. It's like, see what the opposition are supposedly saying. It is the case. I say it in the Psychology of Thelema section of my Crowley book that, you may think that you're on one side of a particular divide. When you go and have a look at what the other side are thinking and how they're expressing themselves, you might well think, oh my God, what idiots, how unsophisticated they are, and that's such an obvious bit of misinformation, blah, blah, blah. But then what should happen, ideally, is when you come back to where you think is actually the zone of what you believe in, you start to maybe see a few cracks in that. You think, well, maybe that's a little bit badly expressed. Maybe that's a very partial opinion. Maybe that. And then, cease to identify with both. It's not to say that maybe one side is still not a little bit better than the other, but it's like the minute you just absolutely knock yourself into any of those extremes, you limit your possibilities massively, and just, always remember, we've been intent to be excellent to each other. It's like, the whole ferocity of this current polarization, the fact that people demonize and are quite prepared. It's the old mythic archetype of the Book of Revelation, the unrighteous, chuck them in a lake of fire. We're the elect. At the end of the day, we're all going to be standing around in white robes and we're going to rule okay, and it's going to be great. Only it ain't. And it never has been, it never will be. It's always just a pile of corpses somewhere as the end result of that one. So yeah, and dig history, man. Just pay a bit of attention to it, especially the history of the 20th century. It's starting the extent to which people, have forgotten even the last 100 years, or don't know enough about it, or it just locks into all kinds of, misconceptions about it.
Yeah. Oh man, that's incredible. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was just an amazing interview too, and I feel like we went in so many different directions.
Yeah, I enjoyed myself tremendously there. I hope that all sort of comes out all right in the eventual YouTube result, and everybody can hear it okay, and hasn't got any problems with my accent and so on.
I think it'll be good. Yeah,
I think it sounded great, man. Yeah,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we hope
thank you guys for sort of, letting me realise I've still got a little bit to say. I'll sometimes go weeks without hardly speaking to anybody, so it's nice to know that I want to still do this.
Yeah, I think clearly you do still have something to say, and we hope to have you on again sometime. Definitely. Yeah. Incredible. Well, thank you so much again, and also what let's get some links on there for people to check out your books and stuff, because that's definitely important here.
Well, I've got an Amazon authors page. My stuff, over the other side of the pond with you guys, it's all on Kindle. I've got 11 books out there. They're all available on Kindle in the States. In the UK, most of my books are still available in paperback form. People do contact me from all around the world and occasionally say, look, can I buy one of your books if I pay all that extra postage? I'm contactable. People can PayPal me or whatever. And, I'm on Facebook. As you guys know, I'm fairly easy to get hold of and to see what I'm up to, which is not on an external form that much at the moment, although next year, hopefully more so. But I respond to events and I do like to hear from people that have maybe connected up to my work and find it of interest in any way.
Great. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Paul Weston. That's amazing. Yeah. Thanks again.
All right. Well, happy days, guys. Here's to sanity and reality.
Yeah. All right. That's it for us.